Hi, I'm Dr. Julia Craner-Cooper, and welcome to Connect with Mary for Mental Health and Well-Being. Today I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Evan Parks, a psychologist who's going to talk to us about stress management, especially how to manage stress during these difficult times. After we hear from Dr. Parks, we're going to spend some time answering your questions and practicing some strategies for managing stress.
I am Evan Parks, and I'm a psychologist here at Mary Free-Bed Rehabilitation Hospital. And I am excited to be with you here today. I'm going to be talking about stress and how stress impacts our lives and how we can manage it. One of the reasons that I'm so excited about what I'm talking about today is I truly believe that the content of what I'm going to share with you could save your life. I like you to think about it as a stress CPR that you could do on yourself. You might be buried under stress right now and you need this, or you're going to be buried under stress at some point in the future, or somebody you care about is. And you want to know, how do you respond? What do you do when you're buried under the load of stress that we often face in the world that we live in today? I have two questions to start with. Number one, what is your relationship with stress? When you hear that word, what comes to mind? Do you feel helpless? Do you feel held hostage? Maybe you have this love-hate relationship with stress, or maybe stress is an enemy. I often think of stress as an unwanted house guest that just kind of like came in and it's set up in our home, and it's like, now what do we do? So what's your relationship with stress? Second question is, what is your view of your stress response? So you might be surprised that you already had a stress response today. If you got into a car and started driving to work, you had a stress response right in that car. Your blood pressure went up, your heart rate went up. What do you think of that? If you sat down at your computer to start taking care of emails that you need to take care of, you had a stress response. Is your stress response helpful to you? Is it damaging to you? Should we avoid stress? Should we avoid that stress response that we have? Is it doing damage? Well, that's what we're going to look at. I had to change my view of stress. One of the things that I learned in college and in graduate school is that stress is harmful. And I embraced that. I taught that. If I can change my mind about stress, I hope I can change yours. So here's the first thing that we're going to look at, a little bit of history. Definition of stress. 100 years ago, there was a guy named Walter Cannon, and he used the word stress. He borrowed it from physics and engineering. Stress has to do with pressure. Well, 20 years later, Hans Selye, a Hungarian, he was studying rats, and he figured out that regardless of what he did, he could produce tumors in rats, cancer, ulcers, and depression. And so his definition goes like this: stress is the response of the body to any demand placed on it. So what he found is it didn't matter what he did to the rats. If he starved them, if he made them sleep deprived, or made them hungry or something like that, didn't matter. That fight or flight response that the stress caused damage. That's what he was thinking at that time. Well, that mindset that stress can kill you has carried over the last 100 years, and we still hold it today. And this is where our threat mindset comes from. This is typically how we think about stress. If you think of 10,000 years ago, you had a person living on the savannah in Africa, and they were running away from a lion. That fight or flight response was adaptive then. Well, we have our fight or flight response right now, opening an email, getting stuck in traffic, being late for a meeting. And we think of our stress response as maladaptive, and we think of the stressors that we have not even equal at all to the kind of stress that we had when we were being chased by lions or running away from wolves. So we think, boy, we have this maladaptive carryover of our stress response, living in our bodies today doing damage. That's typically how we think about it, and that's how I thought about it. Now, there are studies that seem to come along to prove that. So in 2008, there was a huge financial crisis, and they looked at bankers at UBS Bank large international bank, and 100% of those bankers had a stress response of depression, anxiety, insomnia, alcohol addiction, 100%. So it seems to point to stressful event, bad reaction, damage to the body. Another study, 8-year-long study, 30,000 people, and they looked at death records and see who died. Well, they found that if somebody had a significant number of stressors in the past year, their increased risk of dying rose by 43%. A 43% increase risk of dying if they had stressors in the past year. Again, that seems to point to stress is going to kill you, all right? Now here is a second definition. Stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. Now, stress is still about pressure, but look at this. Stress is about what we care about, and our stress response shows up to help us handle what we care about. This is different. Let's go back to the savannah in Africa. Why don't zebras get ulcers? All day long, they're running away from lions on the land. They go to get a drink of water, and there's a crocodile waiting for them. That's pretty stressful. They don't have ulcers. They don't have health problems from this constant engagement of their fight or flight response. So what's happening? Well, let me give you another study that's been done. Picture an airplane, small airplane, up in the sky, and it has a skydiving instructor and a skydiving student in it. The doors open, they're at 5,000 feet. That student has never jumped out of an airplane in his or her life. So what's the difference in the stress response between the skydiving instructor and the student? Nothing. There is no difference in their stress response. It's exactly the same. So what's happening? Well, the skydiving instructor typically has a growth mindset. They don't look at the stressful experience that they're in as something that's going to overtake them and ruin their functioning. They look at that stress that they're under as something that's going to enhance their functioning. Skydiving instructors view stress as a sign that they're excited, that they're going to have fun. They view their stress response as helping them perform something that they need to do, just like that zebra. That zebra looks at that fight or flight response as positive, not negative. Let's go back to those two studies. I only told you a little bit about that 8-year-long study. So here's the rest. 8 years they studied people, 30,000, but they asked one very specific question. Do you view stress as harmful? Of those who believed that stress was harmful, only those people were at risk of dying. Those were the people who died at an increased rate if they had a large number of stressors in the past year. An equal number of people had stress in the past year who did not pass away. Why? Because they actually didn't view the stress as harmful. They viewed stress as a natural part of life. They viewed their physical response as helpful. And they viewed bad things as something they could find a way through, regardless of what was happening. Well, let's go to the bankers. Actually, they studied those bankers as well, and they helped people look at their mindset, and they changed their mindset to the growth mindset. They taught them that stress enhances their productivity, improves their health, helps them to respond better. And when they did that, they lowered the depression, they lowered the anxiety, they got rid of the insomnia, they helped them with the alcohol. All of those things reduced when they learned to view stress and their stress response differently. We hear about adrenaline, we hear about cortisol and the damage that some of that can be due to our body. But we often don't hear about oxytocin. We call it the cuddle hormone because it's released when you're hugging someone. Well, oxytocin is released when we have a stress response, and it encourages us to reach out for support. It helps us to actually repair damage that's done in the heart. Serotonin helps us to be attuned to others, to be more aware, to be more empathetic, to be focused. Dopamine helps us to be optimistic and take charge. We have other hormones that help us repair wounds and actually grow the brain. So The first step of stress management is actually just recognizing that we all have this threat mindset, every one of us. It's in our DNA, I think, from the culture that we live in. So we have to notice our attitudes about stress, and we have to notice our coping strategies. We often treat stress as something to get rid of, something to avoid. We use distraction of all kinds, and we try to withdraw socially, and we try to reduce our activity. We need the growth mindset. We need to see that stress is real, accept that. And we need to see our physical response as normal and helpful, and we need to use problem-solving skills and seek support. Very important for us to seek support when we're under stress. And a key element of stress management comes from our inner strength, our values and our courage. Think of values and courage as two powerful horses that can pull us through difficult times. Values give us direction. Character strengths give us the tools that we need to move in that direction. We have courage, we have patience, love, creativity, faithfulness, humor, gratitude that can pull us through a difficult time. What is within us is stronger than the things that are happening around us. So here's a little review. Try to turn your fight or flight response into excite and delight. Now that might be very difficult if you're in a very bad situation, but realize that that energy that you're getting from that stress response is motivating you to take action. Take action. Rather than withdraw, give into your natural impulse to reach out to people. Take care of your friendship, tend them, befriend others, befriend those who need friendships. Rather than avoid stress, try to accept what you cannot control and connect with your values, connect with your character strengths, and let those become something that pull you forward. And remember this, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. We suffer the most when we fail to accept what we cannot control. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope it saves your life.
Dr. Parks, thank you so much for that presentation. It really seems that our view of stress is really important for how we experience and manage it. But one thing I'm wondering is how does our view of stress really make such a big difference in how our body responds to stress?
Well, that is a good question. And it's not all that easy to answer because there are so many things that are happening in our mind and our body all at once. So what I'm going to use is an illustration that talks about the threat response that we have, or the threat mindset, and compare that with the growth mindset. So let's just imagine, for example, that a few feet away from me, this light post that you can't quite see represents stress. When I have the threat mindset, I'm going to view that stress in a particular way. I'm going to look at it as something that's getting in my way, that's interfering with my performance, that it might do damage to my health, and I just want to avoid it. And so when I have the threat mindset, I'm going to try to move away from it. I'm going to try to control it. I'm going to try to stop it. The growth mindset is really just the opposite. When we have the growth mindset, we are willing to approach something that's uncomfortable with strength, maybe with courage, with compassion, but most importantly, I think, that we approach something that's uncomfortable with openness and curiosity. So I used an illustration of a skydiving instructor standing in an airplane 5,000 feet up and a student. Now both of those people have a very significant stress response, but there's one key difference in the skydiving instructor. Because of their openness to that experience, because of their willingness to experience it, because of the excitement that they actually have about being in that changes their body. And what happens is their blood vessels do not become constricted. And the person who, pretty much like me, standing in front of this open door of an airplane at 5,000 feet, they're not only going to have the fight or flight response, but their blood vessels are going to be constricted. And that actually cascades into many different possible problems that could be in a person's life. But when we move toward those things that are difficult, we're willing to experience them, we have compassion for ourselves about how difficult it is to even experience it, it actually changes our physiology.
Wow, that's amazing. One of the things that you mentioned in your presentation is something about our strengths, like our character strengths. Why is that important?
Yeah, it really is important. And it's for one simple reason. Our character strength and our values really set in front of us what is important. And when we are looking clearly at what's important in our life, we're willing to take action. And when we take action, what happens is the courage and hope that we want to experience, we begin to experience. Many times we don't take action because we're waiting for that courage and that hope to show up. But that courage and hope is not going to show up until we take that step. And we're not going to take that step unless it's clear to us what we need to be doing in that difficult situation. So I'll give you some research that suggests exactly what I'm talking about. So there was this interesting study that was done with 9/11, Ground Zero. Lots of people, of course, impacted by that. People experienced depression and PTSD, common side effects from all that trauma that was happening. Well, there was another group of people who were on Ground Zero who had very little in terms of dysfunction in terms of their mood or PTSD. And those people were people who found ways to engage in helping others. They put a lot of effort, a lot of time into doing what they could. Maybe it was with their time, maybe it was with the resources that they had or money that they had or just giving a listening ear. But the more they were focused on basically living out the values that they had of wanting to help others and to be of service and to make an impact, the less they struggled with the very common experiences of depression and PTSD afterwards.
Wow. Is that the same as saying that we need to try to look for the good in stressful situations or see these things as positive? Because some of those stressors, I mean, they're really terrible.
They are. I'll give you an example of something I think that would be personally quite difficult to deal with. Let's say we're talking about somebody who is caring for someone with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a progressive condition, and caregivers are chronically under stress, and they often burn out. They struggle with depression even. And what has happened is somebody started to do research based on the information that I was talking about regarding character and values and what's important. And what they had them do is record each day something that was important to them that they learned that they otherwise wouldn't have learned. So what they were asking that person to do, that caregiver to do, is to really think not about that stressful situation as good, because it isn't good what they're dealing with. It's a very difficult, painful process to watch someone that you love deteriorate with Alzheimer's. But what they were looking for is where that good was coming from within. They realized that they had strength that they didn't have. They realized that they were able to look at life from a different perspective. They realized that they really, through that process, were developing a deeper sense of spirituality that they hadn't had before. So it's not that we try to look for the good. It's really that in the situation. What we're looking for is the things that in those situations otherwise wouldn't come. So if you think maybe even in your own life of times that you've really grown, it's probably been during those difficult times when you think, wow, I wouldn't ever want to go through that again. But what you gain from it is irreplaceable in terms of your perspective on life and your character.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're talking a lot about our view of stress and also viewing that physical response to stress as being helpful, but sometimes that can be really uncomfortable to experience those physical symptoms.
Yes.
Is there anything that we can do to help manage that more effectively?
There is. I have found that the physical aspect of stress is not something that we're very good at noticing. It becomes constant in a person's life, and it just becomes like the normal state that we feel like we're in after a while. So you can think again of that caregiver working with a person who has Alzheimer's every day. You know, the stress that they carry in their body becomes normal after a while. And so what happens with our stress response is that we have increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, increase breathing, increase in adrenaline and cortisol. We have change in our circulation, so our hands and our feet become cold, and blood leaves those areas and goes to the core of our body, and the muscles in our back and our shoulders and our neck become tighter. And that can become so, quote unquote, normal that we hardly even recognize that we're in that kind of a state. So one of the things that I have done to help myself recognize the difference between this stress state and a relaxed state is to do a breathing exercise. And I teach this to people on pretty much a daily basis in the pain rehabilitation program at Mary Free Bed, where we're working. So what I do is a very simple explanation of the whole breathing process. So we have different lobes in our lungs, 5, and we have these lower lobes right here that are the bottom portion of our lungs. Right under those lobes is a flat muscle, and it's called the diaphragm, and it kind of goes down sometimes if we breathe using the diaphragm. So if my chest moves, my diaphragm's not really being engaged, but if my stomach moves, my diaphragm is pushing down. And what I want to picture is that the lower part of my lungs are pushing down toward my hips. Or you could just picture air going into your stomach. It's not really going into your stomach, but that's a helpful visual. Why breathe like that? Well, the bottom portion of our lungs, those 2 lobes down there, have the best connections with our vascular system, our arteries and our veins, and the best oxygen exchange is going to take place. So typically, under normal conditions, we're just sitting here and talking, our breathing rate is about 12 breaths per minute. And when we're under a stress response, that starts to go up. 14, 18, 20 breaths per minute. We're not even thinking about it. It's just automatic. Well, what we're going to do with this exercise is slow that breathing down to 6 breaths per minute. And because we're using the diaphragm, we're going to increase the amount of oxygen that's in the blood. And those 2 things are going to give a signal to our brainstem right here in the back of the brain. That back part of the brain is controlling the autonomic nervous system. And there's 2 parts of it. There's the sympathetic, speeds things up. Sympathetic parasympathetic rather, slows things down. And so as we do this breathing exercise, the brain goes, hey, there's a lot of nice rich oxygen coming into the brain. There's this slow breathing happening. It doesn't seem like there needs to be this acceleration from the sympathetic system. So just kind of a neat side to this, I've shared this with a number of people, and I know you have too, that benefit from it in ways that they don't expect. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that people benefit from it is a reduction in their blood pressure. Mm-hmm. Because as we begin to engage in this slow breathing, the blood pressure starts to go down, the heart rate goes down. And some of the people that we see who are on blood pressure medications literally have to have their blood pressure medications adjusted over the course of our program, because they're kind of learning to manage that blood pressure on their own. So I'm just going to walk you through this real quickly, and you can practice this at home. So the breath process that I use has 3 steps. I count to 4 on the breath in through my nose. I count to 6 on the breath out through my mouth, and I purse my lips just a little bit, and then I hold my breath for a count of 2. That's an empty breath. So 4, 6, 2. And I'll demonstrate it right here. So I breathe in through my nose, out through my mouth, pause. In through my nose, out, pause. So that's the diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing that I teach people. What I usually ask people to do as a starting place is to practice for about 5 minutes twice a day. And since you and I work in a pain rehabilitation program, you might want to add this tip. If you're struggling with pain yourself, you actually don't want to start practicing this diaphragmatic breathing when you're in a pain flare-up. If you have a headache, if you have your back all tight, you actually want to practice it when you're relatively relaxed. Why? Because you want your brain to associate that slow breathing with a calm state. And that pairing, that association is really important for the brain to get settled and make a good connection with that. If you struggle with sleep at night, this is a good exercise to use. Right before you go to bed, or if you're struggling with staying asleep in the night, which is something we often do when we're struggling with stress.
Thank you. That's a useful tip, and one of the things I really like about that breathing exercise is you can do it just about anywhere, and
Yep.
people won't even necessarily notice what you're
Right.
doing, so
Right.
it's portable.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Parks, we are all experiencing being in a pandemic right
Yes.
now, and one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation is how important it is to stay connected socially.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips or recommendations for people to stay connected
Uh-huh.
during the pandemic?
Okay, excellent question. One of the things that I want you to remember from the presentation is our brain produces this hormone called oxytocin, which is a hormone that we often call the cuddle hormone. It prompts us to reach out to people. And so you want to realize that built into your stress response is this natural desire to want to talk with others. It's really important when you are experiencing a lot of stress in your life that you are connecting with someone, and even if that connection is only for you to share a little bit about what you're going through, so that you feel heard, so that you feel understood. That person, might be a good listener, might not be a good listener. It actually doesn't matter that much. What really is important is that you're sharing that. And that could be on the phone. It could be, of course, through Zoom or other avenues. It could be going for a walk with a neighbor in the evening. That's something that I try to do with some of the neighbors that I have. It's so valuable for us to share our experiences with others and to feel that we are understood. And if you can't even do those things, if those aren't options, consider writing a letter to somebody. Get reconnected with people, even by that old traditional way.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us here today at Connect with Mary. And thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us as well. We hope that this has been useful, and we really hope that you'll join us next month where we talk about nutrition and stress.